Well, hello again, everybody. This is Robert Brighton, and welcome back to another edition of All That Glitters. And if I were talking about champagne today, I might call it All That Sparkles. But we're not. We're going to talk about red wine today, because I like wine. I do like drinking wine. And I've studied it over the years. I've made kind of a hobby of it. My wife is an excellent cook, and my job, because my cooking skills are rudimentary, as you saw from the ink making video a couple weeks ago, my cooking skills are rudimentary. So my job when my wife fixes something for dinner is to pick out the right wine, which I enjoy, and that's plenty. But today I want to share with you some of my tips for how to select a decent wine for dinner. And one that's not going to break the bank, because wines are expensive. They've gotten very expensive, particularly ones from other countries. So today we're going to look at this wine, which is made by, I don't know how to pronounce it, so apologies to the producer. Jonata, I don't know. But anyway, Jonata, let's call it Jonata. Todos. Todos means, I think, everything. This is a field blend. So this is a blend of a bunch of different red grapes that they put together. And this is kind of a daily drinking wine, something you could drink with, hamburgers or even pizza or anything you fancy that requires a kind of a red wine, something to stand up to your food. Not a terribly expensive wine as wines go these days for a wine of this quality. It's probably twice as much as like a grocery store sort of wine, but you're getting a lot better wine for the money. So, my policy is drink less and drink better. And so that's where this comes in. I'm not going to drink 2 bottles of the really cheap stuff from the grocery store. I'll just drink one of these. Well, not myself. But anyway, you know what I mean, I think. So anyway, here we go. Let's start. Let's start with the cork. You've probably seen people in restaurants, they get handed the cork and they go like, and it comes across as very pretentious, I think, and funny. And so there have been a lot of people over the years that say, that's a bunch of junk. You can't tell anything from a cork anyway. They're just showing off. Wrong. You can tell an awful lot about a wine from its cork. So first of all, here's what you can tell. A solid cork, not composite, not plastic, none of that stuff, but a solid cork usually says that the wine inside is a little bit better. Now, I know there are people that are going to argue with me about that, but that's generally true. There are exceptions, but it's generally true. The other thing you should notice about the cork, if you're handed or you take it out of the bottle yourself, is that it ought to be wet or stained on the end that goes down into the bottle. There should be no wine or anything creeping up the sides of the cork, because what that means is if wine can escape and crawl up that cork, air can crawl back the other way. I mean, there's a mass balance going on. Wine leaves, air goes in, and that can age the wine prematurely, or it can spoil the wine. The worst thing that can happen to wine is oxidation. That's why if you leave a bottle of wine open for a couple of weeks, even in the refrigerator, it's going to taste terrible because it oxidizes. They seal the wines with corks because there's very little oxygen trapped in there, and so the oxidation process is very, very slow. But if you see that the cork is wet, it should be a signal that maybe something's not quite right. The other thing you can tell from a cork is that, and this is where smelling a cork actually makes a lot of sense. One of the most common faults of wines that have corks in them is that they can be corked. And that comes from some sort of a spore, I think it is, that grows on cork, or can grow on cork in certain conditions, and that fungus, or whatever it is, gives the wine the smell, and God forbid if you taste it, the taste of wet cardboard. So just picture a pile of wet cardboard, out when you put your recycling on or rains on, just picture the smell of wet cardboard. If you smell that on a cork, just pass on the bottle. You're not going to want to taste it. You'll want to get another one because it's corked. So there are things you can tell from a cork. So don't let people shame you into not examining the cork when you're presented it in a restaurant. Okay, so now we're going to do a little tasting. The first thing to notice is the appearance of the wine. It should be nice and bright, and this is red wine, so it's not clear, but it should look like a little bit like it's shimmering at you. It shouldn't look like it has a lot of particulate matter floating in it. So you look at the color. You can roll it around the glass, and you've heard about how these legs develop. What those are glycerin. Glycerin is like a kind of a mouth coating substance that wine has in it. The more of those legs you see, and the more persistent they are, the longer the finish will be of the wine, the longer the taste will stay in your mouth after you swallow it. So that's a good sign. This has quite a bit of glycerin, and really nice, it should have good staying power. Last but certainly not least is the most important thing of all, and that is smelling the wine. Most of our sense of taste comes from our nose. You can attest to that yourself, because if you've ever had a cold and your nose has been all plugged up, food doesn't taste very good. You don't feel like eating because it doesn't taste good. So the same is true of taste in general. A lot of it comes from your nose. So we're going to take some time to smell the wine. And you can get your nose right in there. And so this wine strikes me as muted and, very like restrained, I guess. In other words, it's not jumping out of the glass at me like some wines do. It's a little bit quiet, which is fine, because a wine like this, which is going to be paired with barbecues and all kinds of stuff, doesn't need to be the star of the show. It's a supporting cast member. So I kind of like that. For this wine, I like the fact that it's not like, whoa, this wine's got to be paid attention to. That's probably not the right use for a wine like this. All right, let's give it a try. Yeah, so that's really nice. It's not a profound wine, and it's not supposed to be a profound wine. It's a really tasty wine. It's a wine you want to keep going back to, a wine you want to sip throughout dinner. You don't want to pound it down. You want to enjoy it and savor it and all that, but it's also, as I say, not like one of the great wines of the world where everybody should sit around in hushed silence, tasting the wine. This is a wine where you can have some fun with people, like, God, you got some hamburgers on the grill and hot dogs, and you got some of this Jonata or Honata or whatever it is in your glass, and you're having a good time. And that's what wine's for, because I think what Benjamin Franklin said, wine is proof that God loves us, because he wants us to be happy. So anyway, that's a little bit about wine tasting. And so if you see me out on the road at one of my events, I've got some more coming up. So come by, talk about wine. Don't get me on the subject or you won't get me off, but I would love to chat with you about it. And in the meantime, cheers and have a wonderful weekend. Have a little wine with dinner tonight, and I think you'll be glad you did. Anyway, thanks for joining. We'll be back very soon.